Hey guys, hey, it's Kevin Schmidt again, physical therapist, bike fitter out here in Portland, Oregon with Pedal PT. Had a question today. Someone asked me a little bit about BikeFit for e-bikes. This is actually really becoming kind of a growing market. We're seeing a lot of people in the clinic for BikeFit for the e-bike. There's generally kind of two things we tend to see with the e-bike market, and it kind of makes sense once we kind of talk this through. So for those of you that are unaware, maybe living on a rock, I'm not sure, but basically there's a whole new category of bikes that are out now that basically can allow you to have assist with that, with batteries and motors and things like that to assist in cycling. And basically that's the e-bike, and that's growing huge. And so the top two things that we tend to see with that market is sometimes not what you're expecting. Oftentimes we never see people with lower extremity issues. So knee pain, lower back pain, things like that. We don't tend to see that in our e-bike market so much more that we would see in the folks with the kind of normal, or shouldn't say normal, but the non-e-bike version. The most common things that we tend to see in the e-bike market are generally hand numbness, hand wrist issues, or oftentimes saddle issues. And the two key things that we want to look at with those is that oftentimes with both of those symptoms that they have, whether that be with saddle issues, chafing, tingling, numbness, or hand wrist issues, oftentimes has to do with saddle tilt and height, as well as handlebar position as well. So why does tilt matter? Well, tilt matters because oftentimes those bikes are much more upright. The bars tend to be a little bit higher than the saddle. So oftentimes people sometimes will have their saddle flat or slightly nose down. Well, when we sit on a saddle that's either flat when our bars are up or slightly nose down, that oftentimes causes us to slide forward. In an effort to not slide forward, we then extend our hands, lock out our elbows, and push to kind of hold ourselves on that bike when we're pedaling. All that excessive pressure dumps all onto our hands. So oftentimes people will tend to get hand numbness, sometimes wrist pain, things of that nature. But that's actually a product not related to oftentimes the handlebar. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But oftentimes has to do with the saddle being sometimes a little too high and with that saddle being nose down. So oftentimes in those cases, what we have to do is actually bring the saddle nose up. If the bars are a little bit higher than the saddle, it is okay to have that saddle pointing slightly nose up. Remember, that saddle acts like a hammock and kind of has to kind of cradle us. And as long as our upper body is a little bit higher, we can have that saddle a little nose up. And actually that feels more comfortable and the ability to hold your pelvis and hold your body without dumping forward. So like I said, so saddle nose up, slightly down. Number two is we sometimes kind of see when they install the hand grips on those, let's say it's a flat bar type of e-bike, oftentimes those are installed where they want to make sure that the wrist is straight if you're on the handlebar. This is incorrect. The most open position that you need to have the wrist in is actually about 10 to 15 degrees of actually backwards bending. So a lot of times you need to roll the grips backwards to allow the wrist to backwards bend a little bit more. This becomes kind of a big issue when you're stopping and when you're braking. Remember, we have to put pressure to our hands as that bike decelerates. We're dumping a lot of our weight and all that force, depending on how fast we're going, into our wrist. And if we're putting all that compressive load into a very straight wrist, that's going to put more torque on your wrist, on your carpal tunnel even. You need to have a little bit of backwards bending there, so when we put pressure through that, it's much more aligned with our wrist and it keeps the carpal tunnel a little bit more open. So those would be kind of the two things that we generally will see in the e-bike market. Basically has to do with saddle issues and wrist hand issues. Most common thing we see, and oftentimes that's remedied with saddle adjustment, oftentimes nose up or down or both, and then also making sure that those hand grips are allowing the wrist in a comfortable position to backwards bend a little bit more. Not too far. If you go too far back and you start getting creases in your hand, that's too far. That will also compress the wrist, but you never want to be compressing or trying to squeeze your brakes with a very flat wrist. You want a little bit of backwards bending, or if I put my hand like this, backwards bend, about 10 to 15 degrees or so. It's gonna be more effective to handle that deceleration of that e-bike as well. So again, if you guys have questions, please reach out. It's your questions and comments that keep this channel going. Again, physical therapist, bike fitter, Kevin Schmidt out here in Pedal PT. If you enjoyed this, learned anything from this, please consider subscribing and click like. We'll see you next time down the road, guys. Cheers.